Hi. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like when I hear the headline, German man arrested in case of homicide and cannibalism, my first thought is, wow, somebody like kidnapped somebody, they tried to like eat them or part of them, and then they killed them. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of crazy. But for this New York Times article that I'm going to be talking about in this video essay, that was not the case. In this specific case, it was actually a kind of more consensual, supposedly consensual agreement for two men in their 40s to meet up, consume one man's genitals, and then the murderer in the case then stabbed the victim to death and kept leftover body parts to, I don't know, snack on for later, I guess. So the issue that I wanted to be talking about in this video essay is if this is morally right or wrong. And I'm going to be looking at two different perspectives of moral theories to try to answer this question. So the first moral theory that I want to look at is utilitarianism, more specifically Mill's rule utilitarianism. And in this case, I feel like a rule utilitarianist might say that the actions of Armin, who was the, I guess, like offender and the murderer at the end of the story, should not technically be judged by the specific consequences of his actions. And it could also be argued that because both men, it seems like there was mutual consent, even though at the end of the article it wasn't sure at the end if it was mutual, but it looked like, looking at all the evidence, it did seem that it was consensual on both parts, which is kind of weird, but you know, people do what they want to do. That's not the point here, sorry. So because it was mutually consensual, it is possible that this situation brought both of them higher pleasures, which is something that Mill talks about, because he argues that like we as people, we can feel higher pleasures and lower pleasures, not just one kind of like overall pleasure. So that it's morally correct because they're both feeling a higher pleasure, which is kind of something you're supposed to get out of if you're making the right moral decision. So I feel like a rule utilitarianist in this case could argue that this was not morally wrong. In fact, it was morally right, just because it brought both parties higher pleasures and it didn't cause anybody any unwanted harm. Or, I mean, it did cause harm, but it wasn't like the victim was like unaware of what was coming. Like he had already kind of consented to what would happen. And the other moral theory I want to look at is deontology. And in this case, I feel like a deontologist might argue that this situation of, even though it was consensual, of like homicide and cannibalism, is morally wrong, because a deontologist mostly believes that morality consists like in reason and being more like making rational decisions instead of listening to like your gut feeling or like things like that. It's more like, okay, like logically, this is the right decision and this is the wrong decision. So I feel like they might argue that to be morally right is to be rational. And in this case, the two people deciding to partake in cannibalism and then one person to murder the other person is irrational. And so in that case, it's leaning more towards the situation being morally wrong instead of morally right. So I feel like different moral theories have different ways of like approaching this situation, and you could, I guess, argue for both sides. But I feel like personally I agree more with deontology's perspective, just because I feel like even if this was consensual, this might not be the right thing to do, like morally wise. Um, but yes, that is my video essay. Thank you.